The latest CBS News Battleground Tracker poll has former Vice President Joe Biden hanging on to his lead as the primary race tightens. Our team spoke to more than 8,000 self-identified Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents in 18 states expected to hold their primaries and caucuses by Super Tuesday. In those states, Biden leads Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren by 5 percentage points. California Senator Kamala Harris and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders are the only other candidates polling in double digits. In CBS News delegate model, Biden is currently estimated to bring in 581 delegates. That's down from the 731 delegates he was estimated to have last month. Senator Warren is not far behind with 430 delegates, followed by Sanders and Harris. Beto O'Rourke and Amy Klobuchar both are estimated to pick up delegates in their home states of Texas and Minnesota, respectively. Joining me now to dig deeper into these polls, we have CBS News Director of Elections and Surveys Anthony Salvanto, CBS News political reporter Ed O'Keefe, and staff writer for The Atlantic, Edward Isaac Dovere. Thank you so much for joining us, Anthony. I'd like you to just give us some baseline knowledge here. How does this delegate estimate work? And this is using the DNC 15% threshold.
Right. And I know it feels really early to be talking about delegates, right? But what we want to do is start out early with this, showing everybody what the campaigns are doing. And they know that ultimately all their sweat and toil in this campaign now is trying to earn delegates to the national convention about a year from now, right? So how do they do that? Well, what everybody should remember as we go through this process is that they're competing in states not just to win, because the Democrats hand out delegates to the top finishers, to a lot of candidates if they finish up there in the top, and actually to everybody who gets over 15%. That's one part of it. They also hand out delegates by congressional district, not just at the state level. So the political takeaway is that these campaigns are going all over these states looking for voters in pockets in places, looking to maybe finish second or third. That's okay. They can stay in if they do. And so how do we in the polling translate that? That's what our model does. And we can geek out about how it works later on. But basically, it converts those preferences from votes into delegates. And what you see right now is that, yes, Joe Biden would get the most delegates, but Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, all in position to get delegates too, some out of California, which is a big delegate prize coming up. And in fact, if you look harder at California in the map, you can see that Elizabeth Warren does well along the more liberal, affluent coasts. That those things tell you a story. Her campaign is currently doing well with more affluent and liberal voters. And then you go to other states too, Iowa, South Carolina, Joe Biden doing better with African-American voters. All of that shows you the map the way the campaigns see it. And so that's the story we want to tell right from the get-go. Long answer to a short question, but that's where
it makes perfect sense. I mean, by the way, basically, so when you look at that map, it tells you a story. It does tell you, and it kind of indicates when you see these campaigns making decisions about how to allocate resources, well, this is why. So, Ed, with that 15% threshold in mind, should we be looking at this group of four, Biden, Warren, Harris, and Sanders, as the favorites?
Well, you certainly look at them as the top tier. Anthony is the one that's convinced us of this, because we now have 2 months of polling data that shows that essentially these four are in your top tier. They're all hitting at least 15%, which, as he just pointed out, is what's needed to win delegates. That second tier underneath them would be Beto O'Rourke, Julian Castro, and Pete Buttigieg, all of whom are in the low single digits, but have potentially a striking chance of breaking into that top tier if they have a good debate, if they put in more muscle into their campaigns in those early primary states, or in the case of Pete Buttigieg, if he starts spending that $24.8 million that he raised last quarter. It's that third tier where everybody else sits at 1% or less, and you just keep asking yourself, how much longer can these people suffer through this if they're unable to break out of that 1 or 2% range? And so, yeah, I mean, if you're looking at who's setting the tone, who's crafting the real outlines of this race, it's those top four, maybe those top 7.
Well, Isaac, as I mentioned, Biden's lead has shrunk over the past month. In June, he held a 14-point lead in early states. Now it's only 5. What do you think drove that?
I think what you've seen here is people taking a look at Joe Biden and taking a look at him and the other candidates now that the race is really underway. The debates were that important thing of looking at the candidates next to each other and imagining what they'd look like on stage next to Donald Trump and how they compete with each other. But also, just as the other candidates get better known, then the advantage that Biden had in name ID gets to be less of an advantage over time. So that's part of what's driving this as well.
All right, Anthony, I want to dig deeper into some of the state polls. What stood out to you from those?
One of the things that makes the difference between how Biden was doing and what he's doing now is that people said they saw Elizabeth Warren as being the most specific candidate and related to that, the most prepared. Those two things were people who thought she was specific also thought that she was prepared. And that's given her a boost. And we said, who's been the strongest so far? And that was Kamala Harris. She got rated as the most strong candidate. Well, both of those things, combined with the fact that people said they thought Warren and Harris and Sanders were all more likely to be someone they thought as fighting for you, is partly behind some of that movement, and we see it across the board in a lot of these states, in Iowa, in New Hampshire, to your question about what's specifically going on, with the exception of South Carolina, where Joe Biden still seems to have a very large advantage, and that again is helped by strong support from African Americans. But you can start to see that dynamic, people kind of kicking the tires in and around each of these top four top-tier candidates.
Right, their assessments beginning to form here. So, Ed, you have been doing a lot of on-the-ground reporting so far this election cycle. Is that backing up what you're seeing in this poll?
Yeah, and not only myself, but I checked with some of our folks who are out in the field station in these early states and sort of said, does this jive with what you're hearing and seeing? And two things stick out to me from the survey. The first, there's a question. Right now, do you feel confident or uneasy that Democrats will nominate someone who can beat Donald Trump? 39% of respondents said they're somewhat confident. 27%, a little more than a quarter, said they're somewhat uneasy. Just 26% said they're very confident that Democrats will beat Trump. That speaks to a dynamic I think Edward and I and others who are in the field often are hearing from voters as we talk to them, that they've kind of applied some punditry to their selection process, where they start to worry, well, I like X, but will people in Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania like them? And there's been this sort of interesting phenomenon that we keep hearing and seeing and reporting of people saying, gosh, Biden's great, Warren's all right, but I don't know if a woman can beat him. Buttigieg is really cool, but he's young and he's just been a mayor. He hasn't run anything bigger than that. And instead, they're going with their heads instead of their hearts. And
why do you think that is? Is there any indication why?
Because they remember what happened in 2016. Remember? They got cocky, and look what happened. They lost, and the party just slid into this depression that clearly, based on this polling answer, continues. And I'll be very curious to see, as Anthony and friends continue to ask that question, whether the confidence increases at all or whether that pessimism and concern remains. And that's something that we'll also see just by talking to voters over the next several months. The other one that sticks out to me, the answers on health care. It is the top issue of concern to voters, no doubt. As Anthony said yesterday, it could be the first, second, third, fourth, fifth biggest issue of concern because it just stands out. But what they're most concerned about is the out-of-pocket costs, not the mode of delivery, not how you would get your insurance, not this debate over do we keep Obamacare and expand it and protect it, or do we switch to Medicare for all, or do we buttress the Affordable Care Act with a public option. Voters don't care about that. They're concerned about how much is this going to cost me.
A kitchen table issue,
where I checked. And that's where I checked with our producers today and said, guys, when you're out there hearing this, are they talking about the out-of-pocket cost concerns that a voter has, or are they talking about the mode of delivery? And it seems, based on what they were telling me, backing up what I've heard, they're more concerned right now about the mode of delivery and less about what it could mean and cost to a voter.
And that goes, and now we have to leave that question on the trends, Ed, so that'll be on there in perpetuity. But yeah, we hear from people all the time. It's not just whether they have health insurance. They say this is the person standing in line at the prescription counter who's got a $50 copay and has to decide whether or not they can actually afford that medicine, whether they can take their insulin. The person who may or may not take their kid to the doctor, even though they have health insurance, because the copay is so expensive. And those are the things, that's what it comes down to in terms of cost. Is there a disconnect? as the Democrats, and as I would repeat what Ed said, as they talk about that coverage, is there a disconnect from their voters? That is the key thing to watch.
So I want to go back, Anthony, to something that Ed mentioned a moment ago, this notion that when you talk to voters, they're very much sort of thinking about this election with their heads and not their guts necessarily, this sort of political punditry aspect to it. If you're a pollster, how does that affect your work? In the past, maybe someone would just give you their gut check response or feeling. Now, though, there could be a little bit more complication there, it would seem.
We've started to ask questions about what you, the respondent, thinks other people think. It's sort of the great bank shot in American politics,
Right.
but hey, look, it's good enough for a lot of political consultants in
Because what does
D.C.
that get you? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, why not have people do it too, right? But it is, and we have asked that. In fact, on the topic of health care, staying on that, we asked people, okay, never mind what you want for a second. What do you think the Democrats would do better in 2020 if their message was? And here again, it came back to go out there and sell health care costs, lowering costs. And there again, you see people, look, in this day and age with a lot of media coverage, with a lot of social media coverage, I think people more than ever, with all the polls out, may have some sense or feel they have a sense of what other people think. And so, yes, it's not surprising that they're starting to game this out. And it makes it a little bit of fun for us, too, because we can ask them those kinds of questions.
Interesting. Well, Isaac, you have a new profile of Elizabeth Warren out in the Atlantic this week. It's headlined, Elizabeth Warren has momentum. Can she build a movement? What did you learn during your time with the senator?
Well, there is a very specific thing that Warren is appealing to people with, and it's picked up in that poll that people feel like they don't like the system as it is. They don't think it should stand the way that it is, and Donald Trump is deep in that for a lot of them, but that they want to know what's going to happen, what goes next. You may want to burn the building down, but what are the blueprints for the next building that you're going to have? And that is appealing to them about Warren. It is coming through in a way with her. People talk about being a Warren Democrat. Her campaign has buttons and T-shirts that says, I'm a Warren Democrat. It's not something you see out of any other candidate. There's no Harris Democrat or Booker Democrat or Biden Democrat. What that means is that people are attaching themselves to her in what starts to maybe be the beginning of a real movement with her. And I asked Warren about this. I said, do you feel like you're leading a movement? She said, oh, definitely. I said, you seem like a weird person to be leading a movement. And she said she knows that it's unusual, but it feels right to her now. That's what it's all been building up to.
Wow, fascinating to hear that. All right, Anthony Salvanto, Ed O'Keefe, and Edward Isaac Dovere, thanks to all of you. Really appreciate your time.